But with the Maoist movement, what happened there was that resistance itself transforms from hidden, individual, to more collective. Yeah, so a transformation of the very nature of resistance takes place in the process, because it was more about collective assertion, people coming together, and these were the things that they could never do in an oppressive social relations earlier.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. George, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you.
Thanks, Hussain. Nice meeting you, and thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. I think one of the things that really stood out to me when I was sort of looking for an academic in social anthropology, one of the things that really stood out to me is sort of your research on this Maoist insurgency that, you know, I mean, I'd be remiss if I said that, you know, this has wide, you know, like a lot of people know about this. This is a very sort of niche issue that we don't know about here. And I thought, you know, bringing you on and discussing this issue in the context of sort of social anthropology and development would really help, you know, raise awareness about it. So let us start off with, where did you sort of, what's your motivations behind doing this research?
Thanks, Hussain, for the question. Before starting research work, I was a development practitioner, and I was working as a literacy worker in villages, also working towards healthcare for many years. And in that period, I understood a lot of problems are centered around the issue of caste, because it is so hierarchical, caste system. You've got the upper caste and the lower caste. And most of the people who belong to the lower caste, the so-called lower caste, are also landless agricultural laborers. So a deeply embedded inequality that you can see. So it is landlessness, because in an agrarian society, land is everything. Land is social prestige, land is your daily bread, because everything is centered around the concept of land. And if you have no land, you have nothing. And that landlessness is also attached to caste system. So if you look at the land ownership in a state like Bihar, which is the eastern part of India, you find the landowners are upper caste, mostly upper caste and the middle caste groups. And 90% of the landless people are Dalit community. Dalits are the lower caste, you know, those who are outside the caste structure. And they are basically the landless agricultural laborers. So the kind of inequality that they suffer. And when they begin to organize themselves, there is a lot more of repressive violence against them. And at the beginning of the Maoist insurgency, especially in the 70s and the 80s, are related to these experiences of violence that these people have gone through. And some leaders, especially inspired by the ideology of Marxism-Leninism, and after the Naxalite movement. Naxalbari is a small village, if I have to speak about the origin of this movement in India. Naxalbari is a small village in Bengal, the eastern state of India, especially the northern part of Bengal, and where the peasants, under the leadership of the Communist Party, organized themselves and went into a kind of armed revolt against the landowners there. And since then, this movement, this Marxist-Leninist Maoist movement, is also called Naxalite movement. And you may be aware that in the 70s in Calcutta, it spread among students, among landless laborers, and then it spread to various other parts of India. And it also came to Bihar. That's where I did my, as a development practitioner, I worked in the 90s. And when I saw this type of violence and the caste system, I wanted to understand more deeply this. What are the reasons for it? How do we explain conflict? So it has to be then seen in relationality to poverty, inequality, conflict. So the need to go deeper into this analysis, I thought I should study anthropology, social anthropology. And I did my PhD in social anthropology at School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. So that's my journey into academia.
It's fascinating because I've had an interest in anthropology quite a bit, especially with relation to inequality and looking at the reasons why inequality comes about, the reasons how inequality is equalized. And when you see a situation like this and sort of the Maoist movements that is generally driven by a feeling of inequality, literally a lack of food, a lack of access to anything, did that at some point have positive results for the Dalit community?
That's a very interesting question, because many people in the 80s, those who joined this movement, when I did my PhD, I went back to the same place where I was working as a development social activist, development practitioner. And then this was one question I asked them. Many of them participated in the Maoist movement, and I asked them, what did you gain out of it? So they gave me one example. This is very interesting. This is an example which many landless laborers give there. They said earlier, when we used to work for the landlord, we used to beg before them, don't kick us out of job. You do anything you want. You beat us if you want. You beat us on our back. Yeah, but not on our stomach, because we depend on you for our livelihood. But it seems after the movement, after the struggle, and many of the big landlords were killed there, and the Maoists kind of established certain supremacy in that region, then same landless laborers would say, now we tell the landlords, if you don't speak with us with respect, we will pull your tongues out. So what I noticed was some kind of a psychological empowerment. Okay, it is true that the wages had gone up, because Maoists were always trying to demand better wages for the poor, landless laborers. Sexual abuse of Dalit women stopped. That was another very rampant thing in the 80s in the villages. So that stopped. But more than all of that, I mean, those are important things, but the psychological empowerment that came with it. So that I would say, one of the main gains of the movement in those places. And you can't just take these people for a ride anymore. That they have empowered themselves. That the transformation, you find, if you're familiar with the work of James Scott, James Scott will talk about weapons of the weak, everyday forms of peasant resistance. Like when you cannot openly fight because your oppressor is so powerful, your resistance takes very subtle forms, often very covert act, like foot dragging, arson, pilferage, or feigning ignorance or feigning sicknesses. these are the ways that you counter the oppressive regime. You cannot, because this is called everyday forms of resistance, hidden forms of resistance. But with the Maoist movement, what happened there was that resistance itself transforms from hidden, individual, to more collective. Yeah, so a transformation of the very nature of resistance takes place in the process, because it was more about collective assertion, people coming together, and these were the things that they could never do in an oppressive social relations earlier.
So for them, what was the sort of trigger point that made sort of the Maoist movement take form and take, and really start to spread?
Yeah, so one definitely was this feeling of oppression and exploitation that people suffered. And when the leaders came into these villages, first I asked them, how did you join? Why did you join? And what sort of led you? Because you knew that there are repressive regime that exists with the landlords. So it seems many landless laborers, when they had first meeting in the paddy fields at night, they would ask the leaders who came, the Maoist leaders, first thing they asked them was, do you have weapons? If you have no weapons, don't come here, because tomorrow the landlords and the people working for them, the muscle men, every landlord would have 3 or 4 muscle men. They were the ones who would make sure that the landlord's regime is implemented. So he said, if you do not have weapons, don't come here. That was the kind of conversations that they had. So the kind of the empowering, both not only from the perspective of a psychological perspective, which I would at some point I will have, perhaps in our conversation, I can bring out more. How do we analyze violence, at a later stage? So this was a kind of process of building up people's power, like there.
And I mean, you mentioned that there is a psychological empowerment which plays sort of a lot in terms of their ability to hold the landowners accountable. But in terms of like ownership of land or redistribution of land, did that ever happen?
That did happen in some villages, because I think there is a history of this in India. Even before this Maoist movement, which in 1969, the Naxalbari revolt and the subsequent spread of the movement, there was also another movement in Andhra Pradesh, or Telangana, which used to be earlier Andhra Pradesh, from 1946 to 51, where when this began, the struggle of the peasants or the landless laborers together with the Communist Party leaders began. What they did was they seized the land of the landlords, very rich landlords, and they redistributed that land among the poor. So it seems some 3 million acres of land were captured and redistributed. That's what the studies of that say. And similarly in Bihar and in eastern part of India, when the movement began, one thing was to capture the land and redistribute among the poor. And also the land which were common land, because every village would have common land or common ponds, fish ponds, and these were all under the control of landlords. And with the movement, what happened was a kind of appropriation of this common land and redistribution among the poor takes place. And also these fishing ponds, which were then more the villages, especially the poor landless laborers, would have control over the fishing ponds. So at that level, along with the structural or psychological empowerment, there was also the redistribution of land, which you were asking. Yeah.
So prior to the Maoist movement, and I mean pre the Maoist movement and post, what was social mobility like for somebody who grew up in the Dalit community?
Definitely what helped social mobility was reservation. Reservation is the affirmative action, positive discrimination. So the Indian Constitution has this provision that people belonging to Dalit communities, in proportion to their population, that they are 15% of 15% of India's population belongs to this community. So therefore, 15% of seats in government institutions, government employment, government educational institutions will be reserved for people belonging to these Dalit communities.
Okay.
So that definitely, especially those who had that chance to go to school, get education, the affirmative action helped as a way of social mobility upward. Yeah. Then a discussion among anthropologists has been whether social mobility came also from a concept called Sanskritization. Sanskritization was a concept coined by an Indian anthropologist called M.N. Srinivas in the 50s and the 60s. He said, there is mobility in caste system, and that comes from emulating or imitating the upper caste rituals and practices. So once you begin to, let's say, emulate practices like, those who are upper castes in India wear the sacred thread. Sacred thread is a sign of sign that you belong to an upper caste group. Yeah. So there have been practices like people belonging to the lower caste would wear sacred thread. They will adopt the surnames because surnames always signify caste system in India. So therefore, people try to adopt certain upper caste surnames. Then there would be like, vegetarianism has been associated with the Brahminical tradition. So try to practice vegetarianism, giving up eating meat, eating beef. So these are ways people try to emulate upper caste traditions. But this is very problematic. This concept has been critiqued, saying there is no real mobility takes place with this.
I mean, it's funny because I read not too long ago, I read something very similar, a very similar concept that took place in China when China enacted the one-child policy. And the one-child policy, of course, was it was legally binding to people in the bigger cities, but for rural areas, they were still encouraged to have lots of kids because the land needed to be taken care of. However, those people who lived in the rural areas, saw their friends who'd moved to the cities and enacted that their sort of, in their minds, their financial condition got better. And they thought, oh, if we do the same thing, we have less kids, we would be financially better. But the reality is the conditions are completely different. And it reminds me of that concept where essentially those who are in power or those who are in positions of financial power, somehow, even if they don't want to, they drive culture.
No, that's very interesting. No, this exists everywhere. I mean, this emulation, but without really making any concrete mobility takes place.
But does it contribute to psychological empowerment, or is it just like delusion?
I think it's more in terms of mobility. There is no concrete evidence, but would it give a psychological feeling that I have now become upper class or upper caste? I mean, this will be something interesting to explore and see whether it has had an impact on psychologically. But as far as concrete situation of reality is, when we confront that, we see that it has made no impact.
So I mean, in the context of your sort of study in this area, and just in general, your studies in social anthropology in these regions that are, you know, essentially determined by owning land. How different is that to other parts of India? I mean, did you do any development work in other parts of India?
In a rural community, I think land becomes a significant factor. Ownership of land or relationship to land is very important. Although now the importance of land is being reduced or declining, with a lot more people traveling to urban areas because of migration, finding jobs, and so on. But then still they have roots in rural India. The latest statistics would say 65% of India is still rural. Therefore, even if you are going for as a migrant laborer to places like Bombay, Delhi, Gujarat, now there is also a lot of migration to South Kerala, Hyderabad, and so on. But still, people come back to, it's a seasonal migration. They will go, and then they will also come back when there is agricultural work back in the villages. They come back to the villages. And therefore, land still remains crucial.
Yeah.
In the whole process of identity and assertion. Yeah.
So let us talk a little bit about the I guess the conditions of conflict that you've been studying and you've been looking at. So what in particular were you looking at? What sort of conditions and processes of conflict were you looking at?
Yeah, thank you. That's very significant question because it relates to my work, trying to understand conflict. And this is where, as I mentioned, I'm trying to understand the relationality of poverty, inequality, and conflict. Now, if you look at, to give a general understanding, these are some conflicts which are persisting, enduring conflict. And in order to understand the enduring conflict, like the Maoist movement in India has been there for last 60 years now, almost going to be 50, 60 years. It began in 1969. And similarly, by the way, I also do research in Colombia.
Yeah, the FARC.
Yeah, the FARC.
Yeah.
So where also you find an enduring conflict for over 50 years. That also began in 60s. And then finally in 2016, they signed the peace agreement. So you find, in order to understand this enduring conflict, we need to go deeper into an analysis of this intersection or this relationality of poverty, conflict, and inequality. Yeah. A connected thing is now when those who are studying conflict, one significant theory that came out into the early 2000s was theory by Paul Collier and Anke Hoffler. They put together the kind of existing theoretical analysis of conflict, and they came out saying it is either greed causes it, or it's grievance. So grievance would mean all those grievance theories would talk about justice-seeking theories, because conflict is there because people are feeling or experiencing inequality and injustice coming from cultural oppression. It could also come from economic, it could come from gender, it could social inequalities or religious inequalities people suffer. And therefore, they organize themselves, and it is a grievance related conflict. Then they would analyze, like Collier and Anke, they would say another type of theory framework that's useful in analyzing is greed. So if you look at the places where conflict is, It's also places where a loot-seeking opportunity exists, a profit-making opportunity exists, where it is Sierra Leone, if you look at, the diamond mining, or if you look at Colombia, you have coca cultivation, so illicit crops. If you look at India, the conflict is now very active in places where there is a lot of mining operations are there. So, or Nigeria, where oil conflict. So therefore, they would say it's a loot seeking. It is greed that leads to conflict. Yeah. And it is true. There is, in all these places, there is profitability is there. Either you kidnap people or you have few guns, you can always earn money. But if you go by that, then we miss out the genuine grievances that people have. So we need to go beyond this idea of greed or grievance if you want to really understand theoretically and empirically, if you want to understand conflict. Because some conflicts might begin as grievance-led, but it might eventually move into more greed-based, So there is a kind of, depending on the actors involved, the number of actors, some may be greed-oriented, but others may be genuinely concerned about addressing conflict. Therefore, my understanding was to find out what is the complex characteristic of this conflict.
It's very interesting because you say I mean, looking at it in this sort of in this dichotomy of either it's greed or grievance is really hard to accept from an outside perspective, because if a conflict is lasting 60 years, could it possibly be that people are just feeling a grievance for 60 years, or have things not changed over time and have developments not happened?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think this is a very important question. How did the 60 years of conflict in places like Colombia and in India, how do we understand that? Has things really changed, or what happened? So in order to explain, I use a framework called the spiral of violence. It is drawn from a small book written by a liberation theologian from Brazil, Helder Câmara. He through the whole framework of spiral of violence, he explains 3 levels of violence. Yeah. And this is very useful for our understanding of several enduring conflicts, the long-lasting conflicts, whether it is in Colombia, India, or in some African countries. So for him, the level 1 in the spiral of violence is the structural violence, which we we just talked about structural violence earlier, the poverty, the caste system, the gender inequality. And because of that, what happens is we got infant mortality, we got lifespan of people very short, we got illiteracy. These are all part of the embedded structural inequality, as anthropologists today would talk about, Paul Farmer's work, Nancy Shepherd-Hughes, who writes about the Brazilian shanty towns. So this is all that inbuilt, deeply embedded structural inequalities that causes violence. That is violence. Although we think it is a normal order. If a child is dying of infant mortality in a community is there, illiteracy is there, we think it is just a normal thing, it looks like. Yeah. But that, for Helder Câmara, is in the spiral of violence, it is violence number 1. And the second, he would say, level 2 of violence, he would analyze and say, when people who are living in these conditions of structural violence, when they begin to mobilize, when they ask for changes, the resistance that they express, it's a resistance that we've talked about, moving away from subtle, covert forms of individual resistance to more collective mobilization. That resistance becomes violence number 2. So it is actually for seeking justice, because nobody is born as a slave. And in human conditions, people are going to react against, protest against. So that then, for a lot of the state and the established order, the elite classes. The second level of violence, resistance, becomes the only violence. The first one is the normal order. The second one is violence. And therefore the state comes out with in the name of restoring law and order, in the name of bringing more normalcy back to normal life, back to the rural areas or wherever the conflict is. The law and order, the repressive violence, state censored troops in the context of Maoist movement in areas where over 200,000 troops are being sent to rural areas where the tribal Adivasis or the indigenous people live. So in every 5 kilometers, you got a camp, a big security camp with over 500 to 1,000 troops stationed. So you see, so for the state, then this becomes, in order to bring it's a law and order problem, the second level of violence. So for camera, will say what the state does then is the third level of violence called a repressive violence. So this is the spiral. So my research is trying to understand how does the spiral operates. And therefore, only by understanding the spiral that we can talk about a resolution, or we can talk about going beyond the spiral, breaking or ending the spiral of violence.
And so you're essentially looking at are you looking at the interplay between the different levels?
I look at the interplay between different levels, and I also see how each level is contributing to the conflict. And therefore, to me, only by addressing or by going deeper into this analysis, that we can really come out with a durable peace process. So that's why, for me, the Colombian peace process was very important. Often what we think about peace processes, like if you look at the number of peace processes that happened in different countries, it's all about demilitarization, that those who are guerrillas or rebels should be demilitarized and demobilized. So the whole focus is on the immediate end to conflict. And therefore, demobilization and find jobs for these people, those who are doing it. But nobody is addressing this deep-rooted spiral that already exists there, the kind of structural inequalities and so on. So this is what ending the immediate violence that Johan Galtung will talk about. This is negative peace.
Okay.
Ending the direct violence is negative peace. But we need to, if you really want to end conflict, you need to go for positive peace. And positive peace can only happen if you address the structural inequalities. So Colombian peace process, coming back to the Colombian peace, so this is a very, very important, significant milestone peace process. When this peace process took place, it took 4 years. It started in 2012 in Norway, Oslo, and then moved to Havana. And finally, in 2016, after 4 years of negotiation, the agreement was signed. And they had 6 stipulations, or 6 provisions, main provisions. And the first one was, we were talking about that structural inequality. Yeah, the first one was comprehensive land reform. Comprehensive land reform. So that would, rural development would mean the land is registered for the poor, they get a share of land, there is education, healthcare, all that is part of this comprehensive land reform. And that will lead to replacement of the illicit crops, they would say, like coca cultivation. Yeah. So that being one. Second is also the reintegration of the combatants into civil society, long-term reintegration, education, vocational training for them. Then victims' rights, how do we address the victims who were the victims of violence? So all that is part of this comprehensive part, of political participation of people, poor, and the rebels. All this is part of this comprehensive peace process. Yeah. Now, there is one more thing about very significant about this peace process that we can apply to other conditions in Africa. We can apply in South Asia. We can apply in the Philippines, where there is another long-lasting conflict going on in the Mindanao region. So that is the gender, the centrality of gender in the peace process. So all these, there were 576 stipulations altogether in the Colombian peace process. Out of that, 130 had a gender perspective. That if it is a rural land reform, then land has to be given in terms of women also. Land has to be registered for women. Victims' rights. Women have to be, because they were the victims of this violence. Therefore, victims' rights should give priority to women's question. Women combatants. How do we have a gender-sensitive rehabilitation for or reincorporation for women combatants? Out of 12,000 guerrillas that mobilized in Colombia, 3,000 were women. Oh, wow. And therefore, how do we address the gender-sensitive reincorporation of women? So therefore, this is positive peace. Addressing structural inequalities, land reform, gender inequality. So bringing together that then becomes, this is the way to address the spiral of, if you want to end the spiral of violence, we have to talk about these type of deeper type of positive, deeper type of peace. And
so essentially, you have to meet it with a spiral of peace.
Yes, it's it is leading. If the spiral of peace should be the problem to the, yeah, no, you are right.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible because you know, I was always under the impression that the sort of these peace treaties, you know, whether they're in the Middle East or whether they're in Africa or wherever they are, I've always been, you know, disillusioned by them, just because at the heart of these conflicts is typically great corporate interests. But now you're saying that the FARC situation is a very well thought out peace plan, or is a very comprehensive peace plan, and it shows that when you tackle these underlying issues and stop looking at, you know, why people get violent, because getting violent is a last resort for any human being.
Absolutely, yeah.
What when you look at this question of why, I think it paints a completely different picture.
No, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you, because it is much more rooted, the violence and conflict, and this is much more rooted, and we need to address the roots. But I also have to say, Colombian peace process, in spite of all these planning and all comprehensiveness of it, is appearing cracks in it. We as academics, you know, when we analyze, we need to look at it, because immediately after there was a governmental change after the peace process, and the new government that came was less favorable to it, to implementing the provisions of the peace process. So state support began to decline, and there is again a recurrence of violence taking place. So therefore, this peace to become concrete, not only we need to have this comprehensive program, but we need also implementation of this taking place. There has to be state involvement, much more committed, international monitoring, continuous monitoring. You cannot say it is my state's problem and, you know, it is ours is a sovereign state and nobody should interfere. I think, especially when we have these kind of conflicts, there is a need to have international monitoring, international vigilance. Therefore, Colombian peace process, if it has to become further implemented concretely, there is a lot more of international intervention needs to be there. I'm not saying intervention in terms of force, you know, intervention in terms of monitoring, evaluation, financial aid, So it is not just given to any individual nation state. It is all our responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
It is a responsibility of the UN. It is a responsibility of the EU. It is a responsibility of several nations.
Mm-hmm.
It is an international responsibility, peace process.
It's a incredible bit of insight, and something that is really eye opening as to how to address conflict by first understanding conflict, as opposed to addressing conflict because you're seeing bad images online, or like of people dying and things like that. So I think it's an incredibly insightful bit of research that you're doing. What advice would you give to anyone that wants to get into researching conflict in particular?
Thank you for asking that question. I've been researching conflict for the last 20 years. First thing I would say, it's a difficult field. But it's a difficult field, and therefore we need more researchers to enter in it. And one thing to remember very closely is the ethics of doing research. That would be one of my advice.
Mm-hmm.
When as anthropologists, we do a lot of field work, we are taught what ethics is. Research ethics is, okay, you should have a consensus of your research participants. You should not do any harm to your research participants. You should anonymize and protect them.
Mm-hmm.
You should be accountable to your sponsors, your institutions to which you belong. These are all perfectly fine. My advice, along with all these ethical principles to the researchers who are going into, is the ethicality of the research is also commitment to the poor. Those who are, because anthropological research or social science research is often centered or often about people who are living in the midst of conflict. And they are poor, they are marginalized. And therefore, any researchers moving into these conflicts, I think the priority principle or ethical principle is a commitment to the poor. That there should be, your work in some way contribute to a social transformation, contribute to certain establishing equality, either through policy programs, aiding the policy, either through development policies that would address inequalities. Therefore, neutrality is problematic. We think research is neutral and objectivity is neutral. That means neutrality always supports the status quo, and status quo is always in favor of the privileged classes.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think Howard Zinn would say, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Yeah. Therefore, the commitment here is to the poor. And that doesn't mean that you are just sort of mimicking them. You are not, it is not an ethnographic mimesis, just repeating what the poor said or did. But you need to engage with the multiple power relations in the field. You need to engage with the type of complex inequalities that exist. You need to do comparative research. So objectivity of your research is not about, as Donna Haraway would say, it is not about an all-knowing, somebody is speaking from above and seeing the reality. It is also always embodied. It is always partial. It is always situated. No researcher has a positionality that is devoid of history, identity, social position that he or she comes from. Yeah. Therefore, I would say objectivity is not about this neutrality, false neutrality. Objectivity is about taking sides, but analyzing inequalities in a deeper, in a comparative perspective. So therefore, knowledge from different places can come together and to enrich us for our action for development and for equality. That's what I would think.
Oh, that's a fantastic. Honestly, it's one of the best bits of advice I've heard from an academic. It really targets the root of so many of the problems where we have this misconception that we can come into a situation and be neutral. When, like you said, neutrality only benefits the status quo and only benefits those who are already benefiting from the current situation. So I think that bit of advice is spot on the money. I mean, it's fantastic. Where can people find you online?
I'm at the LSE, and I'm part of the International Inequalities Institute. And there I'm also part of the Politics of Inequality theme.
Mm-hmm.
And the profile page, my profile page is there, and that's the best place where I keep updating my new research and my new publications. And yeah,
I'll link you onto the episode so that people can have direct access to it.
And I'm very happy to respond to emails. My email is there on the official website of the LSE. So
excellent. Well, Jules, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I've really enjoyed speaking to you.
Thank you so much for asking very good questions that sort of bring out my own what I believe in, what I do research, and my commitment. Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.